Hi, my name is Hannah Lavelle, and I am currently a graduate student at Kent State University. I'm creating this podcast titled Why Journalism as part of my master's professional project in journalism education. Essentially, in this podcast, I want to talk to working journalists or journalism professors or people who have experience in the journalism field, whatever that looks like, and really discuss a few issues, particularly regarding trauma and journalism curriculum and what exactly that looks like. So, I want to kind of explore the trauma journalist experience on the field, how they deal with those who've experienced trauma as well. I want to explore what journalism curriculum looks like at a variety of universities and what professors and those working in those universities kind of think of that curriculum. Talk to journalists about their first couple years working as journalists and their preparation, and kind of talk about the mistrust and the kind of idea of misinformation in the journalism community these days and how they kind of persevere through that mistrust and through that trauma and how what keeps them motivated and what keeps them going. So this is episode 1, which is just titled Trauma. And in this episode, I am kind of exploring the trauma that journalists experience on the field. I think people don't always fully know or understand what journalists experience. And I wanted this to kind of be a platform for those journalists to get their stories out there and for people to realize exactly what journalists go through and deal with when it comes to trauma. Um, I think that a lot of us can assume that journalists um, deal with survivors of trauma and that they are in these traumatic situations, but a lot of people kind of don't think about how the journalists then deal with it, right? So I was inspired to do this project on this topic last summer, really, is when my inspiration struck because of the tragic Uvalde shooting. And just seeing videos of obviously parents grieving that day outside of the school and just crying and watching that, but seeing these journalists on the scene immediately and who were talking to these parents and talking to people, and I was just thinking like, oh my god, like how do you go home and sleep at night? And that was kind of what inspired me to pursue that topic. And it was something I'd thought of a little bit, but I think really after seeing that, it was something that I was really inspired to take on and research and learn a little bit more about. And I did a lot of research for this project, so please do your own research. Look into this yourself if this is something that intrigues you or that you maybe didn't know a lot about or that you are now kind of interested in. But some of the research I looked up, so in 2006 were some of the earliest things I could find. So Gretchen Hoke, she used a survey, who's a professor at Kent State, but she used a survey to better understand the trauma and found that a lot of journalists love their jobs and find them fulfilling, but they deal with a lot of trauma at work due to a variety of circumstances, from like workplace culture to just the stories that they're reporting on and the people that they're encountering and what they're having to deal with on a regular basis. Gretchen Hoke also continued that research and in 2019 published the article Weathering the Storm, Occupational Stress in Journalists Who Covered Hurricane Harvey. And that showed that journalists' exposure to that environment, as well as to the working conditions at that point, and that really, those strict deadlines and those really high stress situations, led to high stress levels, and that even led to PTSD for some of those journalists, and was really difficult for a lot of people, as I'm sure a lot of us can imagine. I don't want to willingly go, to where a lot of people have just lost everything. I'm sure a lot of people can understand that. In 2019, Natalie Seeley published Journalists in Mental Health, The Psychological Toll of Covering Everyday Trauma. And she showcased just how many journalists, are refused to show emotion at work, which is something I kind of talk about in this podcast. But a lot of journalists are kind of told to shut it off, it's to come on and off. And some are able to do that and others not so much. And we kind of discuss that. And like I said, in some of these episodes. And a lot of them have a variety of different outlets that they use to cope. So some of those are healthy, like exercise and running, or just venting with coworkers or therapy. But unfortunately, this trauma, as a lot of us can imagine, can manifest into really unhealthy coping strategies. So things like substance abuse, alcoholism, um, are not terribly uncommon, unfortunately, in journalism. I've learned from a lot of my research, which again is something I never thought of. I think there's kind of like the stereotype maybe of like movies and old TV shows of like, the journalist in like the 20s with like a gin and tonic or something, but it unfortunately really does manifest itself in ugly ways. So that's something just to kind of note. I also found that an article by Doug Underwood, which was published in 2007, and he uses many famous writers who were also reporters. So people like Truman Capote, Ernest Hemingway, Charles Dickens, and those people were all alcoholics or were substance abusers at that point. And obviously, yes, they were writers in other ways. They weren't only journalists and reporters, but that was another big chunk of their job. And that just shows that these kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms to trauma have always been there. And, we see these unhealthy coping mechanisms in people like maybe veterans or people who, have lost someone, maybe turn to these substances. And I think we give them a little bit more of a pass. Like we're like, how could you not turn to that? Or we are understanding. But when it comes to journalists, it's kind of a silly stereotype, and it's not something taken as seriously as I think it should be. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. But there were a numerous amount of other articles I could mention and go on about. I highly encourage anyone listening, if this is something words interests you. There are so many articles out there about like alcoholism and journalists and just trauma and surveys. And it's not even just US journalists. That's kind of what I focused on because that's where I live. But I found articles about like Finnish journalists and in English journalists. So this is clearly a worldwide phenomenon of this dealing with these horrible things. I mean, tragedies are universal, so they're happening everywhere. People are just kind of having to deal with that and again deal with it in a variety of ways. So on this episode, I have two guests. They are two journalists who were so amazing to talk to and who I was so excited to have on. So my first guest, who you'll see, is Brittany Wallman, and she is a journalist for the Miami Herald. She actually shared a 2019 Pulitzer Prize for public service for her reporting on the Parkland shooting. So I kind of talked earlier about how the Uvalde shootings were a big inspiration on this. So talking to someone who reported on a similar tragedy was really interesting. So I will go ahead and put that on. But before I do want to apologize to Brittany. This was the first one I recorded, so I'm so appreciative to her for coming on. But when you see and hear this, you can clearly tell I'm very nervous. And unfortunately, there were a few tech issues and it was very echoey. So I apologize to viewers and listeners, but also to Brittany because unfortunately, I feel like those tech issues, I hope they don't overshadow the great conversation we had. So this is that conversation. I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about regarding this. So I'm in grad school right now. I'm actually a teacher normally. That's my actual job. But I am studying journalism education, so for my big project, I decided to focus on trauma and mental health with journalism. So I guess to start off, how do you define trauma, and what does it look like for you?
How do I define it, did you say?
Yeah.
Well, are we talking about the like dealing with people who have been through trauma, that we as reporters dealing with story subjects who've been through trauma? Or are you talking about journalists, their own trauma?
Both.
Okay. Well, I've been in the business for about 30 years, and it's only even been discussed in the last 5 years or so, or maybe 6 years. And the first time that I ever even heard of the concept that anybody cared about it was after the Parkland shooting, and we were covering that, which was a very traumatic experience for our newsroom. and somebody brought in some therapy dogs into the newsroom one day, and also other newsrooms like sent us care packages, and it was like, wow. Because usually, historically, you're just supposed to just suck it up and deal with whatever you deal with, and there's no attention paid to the mental health of journalists.
Mhm.
So that I think was a great development. And then there's also just been a lot more attention paid on how we treat story subjects who've been through trauma, you know,
Yeah.
just to avoid re-victimizing them, and I think that's just what it is in a nutshell. Is just we absolutely are in a position to re-victimize people through just getting the story out of them.
Right.
Right. So
I love that they sent you like baskets. That's so nice.
yeah, we did that. Then we've tried to join that tradition
Mhm.
and send, like, if there's a mass shooting, which now is all the time,
Yeah.
because it was meaningful. It really meant a lot to us.
How close are you to like the shooting itself?
In terms of
Like,
geography or what?
yeah.
Well, our newsroom was about, I don't know, 15 miles or something.
Oh
I
wow.
mean,
Okay, so right there.
yeah. And, a lot of us had kids in school, not that school, but,
Mhm.
it was in our community. So uh, even just, I had a daughter in high school across the county.
Mhm.
And so there were just so many different reasons why covering that was traumatic for everybody. Um,
Yeah.
Not to diminish what real trauma was, losing
Yeah.
somebody in the shooting, but you know what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I honestly got inspired to do this after the Uvalde shooting last year,
Oh,
being
mm,
a journalist. Like on that day, it's like I don't know how you can go to sleep that night. I mean, like I said, I'm not a journalist. I've not never been one. So it's like it's hard. Being a teacher is very emotional. Like I feel like we kind of deal with kids' well-being, but like having to
uh-huh.
do these dramatic things and life or death situations regularly, like it just blew my mind.
And you know what, what is kind of unique about it as journalists is that, I mean, because a lot of different jobs deal with trauma,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to sort of build relationships with people. And so, um, I also was involved in a sex trafficking project last year. And so it's just like suddenly you've got in your little universe these people that have just so much pain, and they ask a lot of you because you're like a support system. And like one woman asked me to go with her to see her granddaughter's body at the
Oh my
crematorium
god.
after she was like dumped out on Alligator Alley. And you know I mean, that was just so horrific. But you kind of have to say yes to those things, because if you sign up to be a journalist and you're in news, I mean, you have to be the witness of things,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing really prepares you for, you really have to focus on self care and trying to just process that stuff. And it's not even your trauma. You're just carrying other people's trauma. You didn't even know these people.
Yeah, right. You brought up earlier too the point of how in the past it was very much kept up. How do you think newsroom culture can also contribute to that trauma, and do you think it's changed kind of as years have gone on?
Well, there's still a big mix of old school people and people that have been educated now in journalism schools that this is even something to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the whole stigma around mental health has changed, but it hasn't totally changed. There's still a lot of people in the newsrooms that, you know, I mean, it's like, we need the job done. We don't, I mean, you don't necessarily want everybody on staff to be like, oh, I need to, have go meditate for a day or something,
Yeah.
So um, it's still, I mean, even though it's at least talked about now, like when we were covering the trial of the Parkland shooter this past year, they definitely did talk about how the lead reporter was going to need some time off, and he had to walk through the school and see the blood and all that stuff. And,
Yeah.
and that's one of the first times that I can remember it even being raised as a valid issue. So I think it's come a long way, but you're still, you still have to get the job done. I mean, you still shouldn't even go into journalism if you don't think that you could um, handle
Mhm.
like, I mean, witnessed an execution for the paper.
Ugh.
I mean, there's just so many things. I mean, you don't have to do all those things, but you might have to do a lot of them.
How much, and I don't know for sure, how much of a say do you get as a writer? Like, if there is something that you're just like, I'm not comfortable with it.
Well, if you did that too many times, I mean, I'm just to be honest, okay.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, officially, I'm sure they would say
Yeah.
it's fine, But if you did that very many times, I don't think, especially if you were covering, if you're like on the cops beat or breaking news, you really can't be saying, I can't cover that. I mean, but when the reporter I was just referring to, he said, when they go back into the school, I'm not going. And he wanted me
Yeah.
to go. And they said they weren't going to make him go, you know. Um, and they let him, when I covered, they had like a shooting reenactment, which is kind of crazy. He didn't want to cover that, and they said that was okay. But he's been here a long time. He has a lot of stature in the newsroom. If
Right.
you come in and you're talking about I can't cover that, I just I don't think it would be great for your career.
You kind of have to earn it.
Yeah, and even still, it's just this is a job of witnessing what's going on and sharing it with everyone else. You kind of have to have you know the whatever fortitude
Yeah.
to deal. If unless you're in sports or features or something, you do have to have some toughness.
Do you think younger people are told that before they go into it?
No, I don't. From what I see, I mean, we have younger people in our newsroom, and I've heard them being surprised that because when you've been in a newsroom a long time, there's a lot of really callous discussion about big catastrophes with a lot
Mhm.
of dead bodies and stuff. I mean, you just get used to like, oh my gosh, well, how many are dead?
Yeah.
And um, and this one reporter was upset because she overheard a TV reporter calling their editor and acting all excited that she got an interview with the family member of a dead person. And so I could just tell that that was surprising to her, and she's just went to a very good school. So I think it's yeah, no, you, I think it's maybe more than what people would expect. Well, we're down here in South Florida. There's tons of crazy news all the
Yeah.
time. I mean, you know,
Yeah, Florida has like that reputation of like what your birthday and you type in like Florida man on Google and
it's
there's
totally insane. I mean, so if you were in a small town in Oklahoma or something, you
right.
might not, you know.
Do you think that there's knowledge from like the general public that they're aware that journalists not only experience trauma but also have to carry, like you were saying, other people's trauma on their back? Like, do you think people are aware of that or becoming more aware of that?
I don't think they care. Another development, since I've been in journalism, is that is just a lot of disparaging of journalists and the like overall reputation of journalists has really slidden, in the last couple generations. And to me, I think it just comes across as whining. Nobody wants to hear because first responders, legit, okay,
Right.
they're like giving CPR to a drowned child or something. And so I just think, or an ER nurse, or there's so many um, occupations that are revered in our society that do deal with all kinds of trauma, and which is, and I agree, I revere them too. But so I just don't think that journalists is one of those categories. I don't think that people care, or, they think, if they hear it, they just think like, you know, whiner.
Yeah. Are there any like misconceptions about that you'd want to clear up, or like what would you want the general public to know and understand?
Well, I think the main misconception that I hear all the time
Hmm.
is this idea that we go out to try to exploit um, catastrophes, for money, because so we can make money or something. And the truth of it is, you know, I don't make more money if 10 people die in a plane crash. I mean, reporters in general are people that they care about their community. They want to do a public service. They want to get people's story out. I mean, they're almost every real journalist that I've worked with over these years really cares about their community.
Hmm.
We don't make a lot of money,
Right.
you know, and there is no, I mean, sure, there might be those people out there, or maybe in TV or some, but like mainstream media people are not, we're just trying to do a good job on the stories. We're not trying to get out there and like, you know, magnify it and make it worse and, exploit victims and all of that. That's just not really what journalists are about.
What do you do to deal with these things when you like when you were dealing with Parkland, or what do you how do you and your coworkers kind of deal with that and cope? I was researching, and there was a lot about how journalists unfortunately have a really high history of like alcoholism and drug and substance abuse. I mean,
Yeah.
just truly, and you look back, it's like, oh, because they were dealing with this. But I guess what are some ways that like have you seen that unfortunately with people you knew, or like what do you and the people you know do to kind of help yourself?
There's absolutely lots of drinking in newsroom culture.
Hmm.
Um, when I was covering Parkland that year, was training for the Chicago Marathon. I had never run a marathon before, and I just thought I could just tell that this was going to take a lot out of me covering that, because it was going to be like a long commitment, and like bringing people into my inner circle that have like so much pain and sadness that I was going to have to be there, to share. So I just purposefully took on something that I thought would be a healthy outlet, and it's hours of running, and I spent just so much time processing that stuff when I was out there running. I mean, it was just that was my therapy, and I think it was a good strategy. I mean,
Yeah.
I there's not a lot that you can do. I mean, go to therapy maybe, but I mean, I don't. I guess to answer your question, other than drinking, um, I'm trying to. I don't see a lot of good coping strategies, and people do burn out, and a lot
Yeah.
of people have left the business. I
Hmm.
mean, if you look at the team that covered Parkland for us, they're almost all gone from the paper.
Wow.
Yeah.
We even I had some people I messaged for this, and some of them were like, "I'm very close to burnout. I can't take anymore, on my plate." And I was like, "Totally understand. Like, don't feel obligated." But that's definitely something I'm finding a lot. I feel like journalism is similar to teaching in that way. I feel like people are leaving. People are realizing, like, not for me. I can't deal with it. This is too much. I'm out.
Yeah. I mean, but they're both, it's very rewarding. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, with that and like this sex trafficking project that we did, the good part about it is, and what makes you feel like, okay, I can do this, is when you just get a lot of thank yous, or there's, you get legislation passed, or, I mean, all kinds of impacts from, what we did. And so it makes you carry on because you're like, you can spend your life in any number of careers trying to make money or, just have an easy life or something. But it is a super rewarding um, thing to be in. Journalism really is powerful, you
Right.
know, it's there is a lot of power in journalism,
Yeah.
and if you believe in it, I guess then you just accept that it's going to be stressful.
Yeah. That's really all I have for you. Like I said, it wasn't going to be too much, but if there's anything you wanted to add or anything like that.
No, I think it's awesome that you're focusing on this,
Yes.
and that's great.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. Have a good
Have a
night.
good one. Bye.
Bye.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Brittany. It was really a great conversation to have, especially with someone who has reported on such horrible things and who's been a reporter for a while that I really respect and look up to. So that was really exciting for me. My next person I'm talking to is Eileen Kelley. So Eileen Kelley and Brittany actually know each other, funny enough. They were coworkers, and Eileen actually recommended reaching out to Brittany to me. So I ended up meeting with Brittany first, but I ended up talking to her thanks to Eileen. So I really appreciate Eileen for that. So thank you. But she is a journalist. She recently moved from radio broadcast to print journalism. So we kind of talked about the differences between that. Um, and we discussed kind of how she deals with trauma and the humanity that comes with being a journalist and making sure to always treat those that you are dealing with respect, humanity, and understanding the best you can. And we talked about that. We also talked about just the emotional toll, and she discussed how she never has been someone to hide her emotions, which is something I really appreciate and really like. I'm a very emotional person. It's very hard. It's all over my face. So hearing that from her was really nice and really it was nice to hear that mentality because again a lot of times you hear that kind of shut it off kind of mentality, so talking to her about that was great. So this is my conversation with Eileen.
Introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Eileen Kelley. I'm a veteran news reporter. I spent 30 years as a print reporter, primarily crime and investigations, multiple papers. And in 2022, about a year ago, I switched to public radio. So I am doing the same thing, investigations for a public radio station in Southwest Florida.
Awesome. So as you know, this is going to kind of talk about trauma, and I feel like especially with you talking about being in crime, there's surely a lot of that in a lot of situations where that would arise. But just when you hear the word trauma, kind of what do you immediately think of, or where does your brain go?
I'm sorry, you froze.
Oh, sorry.
You said
Okay, so
yeah, you
just
said being in crime, there's a lot of situations, and then it
I'm
froze.
sure, yeah, there's a lot of like trauma that would arise, kind of working in that specifically.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
but when you hear the word trauma, where does your mind kind of initially go?
I mean, there is so much trauma in the world, and I think, I mean, it's the victims, it's the families, it's being there and seeing true heartache, and then experiencing it yourself. It's like life is pretty unfair to people. We're a pretty violent society, and very violent, not pretty. We're a very violent society. And, when you say the word trauma, I immediately think back to hundreds of funerals that I've covered and the wailing of
Yeah.
mothers and grandmothers and the trauma that they're suffering and that others suffer as well, including journalists.
Yeah. Do you have any, if you're comfortable with it, personal experiences that have really stood out to you over the years that you'd be willing to share?
Sure. My first daily newspaper job, early 90s. Um, I was called to a press conference, urgent, get to the school board. And I was covering education, and they announced that the superintendent had been killed by a teacher.
Oh my God.
And yeah, and immediately I just started crying. And
Mm-hmm.
like who the hell does this was before Columbine, this is before school shootings, but this was a teacher who actually killed a superintendent. And I remember a lot of people kind of looking at me, and I'm at the underdog paper, the really small paper, but I was just like, oh my God, who does that? And so I went back to the newsroom, and I kept crying as I was like writing this story, like, how is this happening? I mean, this is my first job, first daily newspaper job. I had been a weekly for a couple months. And the editor, who was actually one of the meanest editors I've ever worked with, suddenly found her heart and said, after the story, she's like, I really think you should go home. I'm sure that this is really traumatic for you. And have you ever had to write about anything like this? And I was like, no, I've gone to one funeral in my life, and I didn't even know the person. It was someone in college. It was her grandmother, and she kind of wondered why we were there too. I'm like, and so next thing you know, I'm at a funeral where there's hundreds and hundreds of school children there, and I'm thinking, my God, I'm in my 20s, and this is really my first funeral, and look at all these kids, and how are they coping? And so, of course, I cried through the whole funeral, and a photographer came up to me afterward, and he asked my name, and I'm thinking, what a strange, what, you're trying to pick me up? You're going to ask me for my number? And I was like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I was taking all these amazing photos of you. You're so emotional. And then a reporter heard this and turns around and goes, well, she's a reporter. And he's like, oh my God, I've wasted everything on you. Like, you were going to be my lead photo. He's like, why were you crying? And I was like, what the fuck? I was like, what is wrong with you? How could you not cry?
Oh my God, yeah.
Teachers aren't supposed to kill superintendents. Call a meeting with them and pull a gun out of the briefcase and kill them point blank. What the hell's wrong with you? And I think as a female reporter, back when in the 80s and 90s, when females were breaking out of the features, the women's department and all that. And I had always wanted to be a crime reporter. And at this point, I was still an education reporter, begging to be a crime reporter. But, I think somewhere in my brain was this notion of never let them see you cry that was coming from somewhere, because, at a crime scene, a lot of police officers will see a woman and they're like, this is no place for a woman to go, and I'm like, well, it's my job, and if you promise not to arrest me if I don't stop at, red lights on my way out of here, okay, I will leave as soon as I can, because cops have told me that, like, don't even stop for red, you're in a really bad part of town, kind of stuff. But, but what I'm saying is, like, there was this notion of never let them see you cry that somewhat was coming down on me, but honestly, I can't help it. I cry all the time. All the time.
Yeah,
I have covered over 100 funerals, and I have easily cried at every single one of them. And to the point, I was covering the military for the Denver Post at the start of the war, and so that was a lot of them. I had done, a few more after the superintendent. Trying to think. Well, actually, no, I had done quite a bit. I take that back. And then when I went to was writing for the Denver Post, there was just one after the other, and it wasn't just these quick shots of who this person who was killed in combat. It was me speaking to the 20-year-old widows, these young war brides, and their parents, and then I would go to the funeral, and you try and be respectful and not cry too loud and be disruptive, but sometimes it's really hard. And I had one of the PIOs that handles the media. He would never go in because he was a Vietnam vet and it was just too triggering, but he would wait outside. And he pulled me aside one day, this is probably after, I don't know, 60 funerals or something. And he was just like, I'm really concerned. I understand that you're having a tough time in there, that you cry. And I was like, well, Richard, you should be concerned the day I don't cry. I was like, that's when I need some serious help. The day that I don't
Something's
cry
wrong.
is the day that I am broken. And it finally did me in. And, I was like, but are people saying I'm disruptive? Like, because I try so hard not to, just to let the tears go, but not to be the,
Cry out and
which is what I
yeah.
have done before. And like, I broke down in a court case, an awful, awful court case. And,
Mm-hmm.
and it was so, I like always have that part together. Like, you don't want the jury to see you sobbing, and,
Right.
but it was hard not to. The jury's crying. The medical examiner was crying as she's describing just horrific, the anatomy of a 8-year-old girl who had been raped. And she was describing this anatomy. And she was a very tough person that was, quite frankly, really mean. And when I saw her crying, I'm like, holy shit, she has a heart, And
Yeah.
so she starts crying and I start crying. And this old bailiff, and the defendant was like 80 some years old,
Mm-hmm.
this grandfatherly monster. But then this bailiff, who was also old, saw that, I was really, really like wiping my face. And so he handed me a tissue, and just that kindness of him,
Yeah.
just, I don't know why I lost it,
You
because I
cry
was like,
more.
oh, good. There's a nice 90-year-old. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
and he was like, out. And I was like, no shit. And I went racing out and literally like fell to the ground, like sobbing,
Mm-hmm.
because, it's this life is hard, man.
Yeah.
That poor little girl, her family, and so, I cannot, I'm very empathetic. And when people cry, I absolutely start crying immediately.
I'm the same way. If someone else is crying, I'm crying with them. Like
Yeah,
when
I don't
another
know how
person.
not to,
Yeah, I don't
not in
either.
it's not in my DNA.
Mm-mm.
You know, I don't, a lot of times I end up, stopping the interview because the person's crying so much and I'm feeling awful. And I'm like, okay, I'm so sorry, because I'm crying and they're crying. And, um, but I've stayed in touch with a lot of those people that we've
That's
had
cool.
both of us crying, and,
Yeah.
and I'm Facebook friends with them, or they write me letters. So like, I finally got someone I could talk to and really let it out, as opposed to family members who are like, oh, be strong, be strong.
Yeah. They just
Whereas,
don't get it.
when you're having an interview with a journalist, it's what happened, and how are you, and how are you, dealing with this kind of stuff. So, um, I, yeah, there's a lot of trauma, and I immediately go back to the people that are the true victims,
Yeah.
of it, you know, and that we just try and give voice to them, give voice to the dead. Um,
What are some ways you found helpful when you are dealing with someone who has trauma? Like what are the best ways that you found to approach that?
to approach them.
Yeah, to approach people who are experiencing, the worst day of their life.
Mm, it's really hard to be a journalist. That whole knocking on the door is,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I'll sit in my Jeep and I'll write a note and have it all ready to go with my business card, like, handwritten note of, I'm sitting in the driveway, almost hoping you won't answer the door, because I hate my job sometimes, but I have to do it,
Yeah.
and I just want to give voice to whoever it is, and
Yeah.
just let you know how sorry I am. And if you would like to sit down or talk on the phone, this is how you can reach me. And there are some days that I knock really lightly, you know,
Yeah.
because it's that is the toughest part of being a journalist, is the
I
cold
can
calling.
imagine. Yeah.
I mean, I have been in a situation where I've informed people of loved ones' deaths, and I'm like, what do you mean you didn't know? You know, not like direct parents or husband, wife, but like next to kin, slightly removed. And,
Mhm.
when I'm like trying to find relatives and when you start to realize like, wait, why are you calling? I'm like, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. No, 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 no. And they're like,
Yeah.
you have to tell me. And I was like, oh shit,
All right. Well.
but these people also, no one's ever gotten mad at me for it, that they're not on the list, for police to call. They're not the immediate next to kin. And um, so for dealing with people in the worst days of their lives, it's just you got to be human,
Yeah.
and let them know that you were really struggling to do your job, and that I'm sorry I have to make this phone call, or I'm sorry I'm standing outside your door hoping you don't answer because I mean, that's just being honest, and but
Yeah.
it, like but people do invite me in when they do answer. And I think it's probably
That's
because I sit there and I've already got tears in my eyes. And because, you go to people's houses because of something awful that's happened. And
yeah.
you think, like, how could society do this? Like, what the hell is wrong? You know? And or what
I
happened
think
or who,
too. Like.
whatever the situation was.
Mhm.
And so people do invite me in. It's
Yeah.
into their lives, and it's pretty remarkable, and it's an honor. And again, in 30 years, I've really stayed in touch with a lot of people.
That's
Um,
great. I think making it
with a
clear
lot of
too that
people
you're
who have
not
never
like.
done any interview.
Yeah, and making it that, like you said, making it human, and that you're not just using them for this story like a one and done. I
No,
think like it
yeah,
seems making it clear that like you said, giving someone a voice or giving this more attention is your cause, not
yeah,
just
and
like
telling
you getting
people,
the attention.
that I intend to follow through. I mean, a lot of times police will say to families that victims like don't talk to the press, and people will tell me
Mhm.
that and like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk to you. I'm like, says who? I'm like, you don't have to.
Yeah,
And like, oh, well, the cops. I'm like, well, it's the cops is part of the reason why your child's dead, in cases like
yeah,
that. And I was like, you can make up your own mind here. You're not going to get in any trouble. They are the ones that did this or they messed up. But
yeah,
yeah, it's not just for story. It's if they want to tell their story, it's not my personal gain. It's
right.
if they want, we are this vehicle, and we will help in to amplify your voices and their voices, and to see that there's justice, for depending on what the situation is. So
This kind of goes back to what you're talking about being insecure about like crying in front of people or at funerals, like you kind of being a woman, you don't want to show that emotion all the time. But how do you think like newsroom culture contributes to trauma that journalists experience?
to clarify, I think I had these forces telling me not to cry, but there was no stopping. I
Hmm.
was always going
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
Yeah. So, I'm different than that. But, like that, when that guy who I thought was trying to pick me up and he was like, why were you crying? I'm
yeah,
like, what the hell's wrong with you? And I'm glad
yeah,
you're not
right.
asking me out, because I'd say, hell no, you heartless person.
So,
So, but the newsroom culture, it's very much like sadly, it can be a lot like a police department where,
mhm.
you, where it's so prevalent that sometimes humanity is, a lot of police officers, and I've known a lot, of law enforcement officers, and sometimes the only way for them to protect their hearts is to try and shake it off by finding humor, and or trying to talk
Mhm.
about anything but the goriness, and like they kind of shooting the bull with each other and with journalists that are constantly like, oh, another dead body, that kind of stuff. And it's not right. It's not
Right.
right. But I get why people put up these walls, and I get it because, I mean, I sometimes you just have to you have to say these or think these things to preserve your heart and
Mhm.
so you don't break. But I'm not like that. So, but some newsrooms can be, and
Yes.
I have to say that I haven't been. I for years I had all these autopsy photos on my desk, and when people wanted to be a crime reporter, I would slide them over. And this is someone who jumped from I don't know, the tallest building in Cincinnati, and
Right.
they're awful. It's like a horror story.
Right.
And I would show them to people, and I look back at that and I think, why did I do that? Except for I wanted to see, like, are you going to be okay? Because you are going to see stuff like this.
Mhm.
You're going to show up at a crime scene and you're going to like, oh, those are entrails, from those are someone's guts on the ground, and so, and you know, I, when people would want to, say, oh, I can do this, I'm like, are you sure? Just look at this.
Yeah.
I'm more impacted by the living's reaction than
Yeah.
the deceased. Like, again, I'm wondering, like, should I have ever done that? And I wasn't making fun of people,
I
but
see
I
what you
just
but you
wanted
like
to
you
see
look back like, was I not being sensitive to this? I see what you mean though. Like it's more
to the
I
dead
think there's like
person, but I was also
yeah,
trying to see, like, can you handle this,
can you stomach
and
this?
again, like, I'm the one that cries when people cry, when I see suffering of people. And
Mhm.
that's not to say if I see a dead person, I'm going to laugh at all. No, 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 no,
Yes.
no, no, no. I immediately think, my God, their poor family, their parents,
Mhm.
that who should be showing up here any minute, particularly back in the day when we had police scanners, like a million of them, all right, six or
Mhm.
something. And we would try and beat the police to the crime
Yeah.
scene so that we could get there before they cordoned us off. And that was
Mhm.
always we're listening in real time to the same stuff that they're listening to when the dispatchers are like, all right, we've got,
This address. Mhm.
yes, and at a dead person here at this address, they would use codes and things like that. Um, and so it was always this race to get there. And so I, particularly in my young years, I did see an awful lot. And again, I went on and I continued to cover funerals, for doing big crime takeouts. I wanted to get this idea of, when I was looking at, like, people that were killing each other in the cities, and how
Mhm.
in many ways these funerals were becoming pageantry, of, oh, showing up in Rolls Royce, just
Yeah.
trying to really understand, like, what's going on. But then I would always zero in on the grandmother and the mother and try and put that
Mhm.
noise behind me, but I needed to understand the culture of what was going on, um,
Right.
with so many people getting killed that were all drug dealers, that kind of stuff. And so,
Mhm.
um, I just frequently was always going to funerals, whether or not I was going to cover on deadline or not, or if it was going to be part of this big project about the culture of what's going on, in some of these cities and kind of stuff. And um, I have at times found myself going back to the scene of crimes by myself and to just bawl where I can, where I'm not, you know, where we're
Yeah.
not surrounded by other reporters going, what the hell's her problem?
Right.
Where I have to,
Yeah, just that reflection.
I have to let it out, kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, do you think that like the general public fully understands what journalists go through or like this trauma or do you think they even care? Or what would you want them to know about journalists and journalism?
Well, I think, most people don't deal with journalists. They see us on TV, they
Mhm.
see us running after people and microphones in your face, did you do it? Did you kill her? And yeah, that sometimes you
Right.
have to do that. And a lot of times cops set that up, what's called a perp walk. They want the glory
Mhm.
of having someone, shielded like this, and oh, here he
Right.
is, and And
Yeah.
so they see that, they see kind of this vulture like, and I mean, I try so hard not to be that vulture. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I just I want to write, I want to be a voice, you know, to them. I want to hold people accountable, you know, find out, you know, should this have been stopped, you know, depending on if it's like a domestic violence situation or where someone had been crying out for help. You know, I would like, you know, unless people are seeing movies about journalists, you don't really get to the heart. And usually all those movies are about female falls in love with male source or whatever, you
Yeah.
know, that storyline, which also stop. That's not really what happens a lot, you know. But yeah, I think that we just get portrayed generally as kind of vultures, um, where, you know, that's the last thing I want to do is to make someone's life harder, you know.
Yeah. My last question for you actually is just how do you and others you know kind of cope with this trauma? What do you kind of do to free yourself from it or to get it off your mind, or how do you cope? Because um, I found like a lot of articles when I was researching. It was unfortunately like how um, uh, like in journalism, there's a lot of people who struggle with substance abuses and alcoholism to kind of, and we've realized now, like, oh, it's a coping mechanism. But how do
Oh,
you
it's
find like
absolutely,
your
and
healthy
it's,
ways
yeah,
for you and others?
healthy. Yeah,
Yeah,
still working on
healthy-ish.
that. Still working on that. No, just I cope by pouring my heart into it, into,
Mhm.
you know, writing a story where I'm releasing. You know, I am. You
Yeah,
know, I do a lot of big narratives. I did before public radio, a lot of narratives and takeouts, and I just sit there and just bawl as I'm writing, and that to me is the reason that, you know, the reason I've invested so much time and heartache and trying to get the family to trust me to tell the story. And my coping mechanism is the when I'm finishing the product
hmm
and really releasing all the emotions. I mean just sitting at my desk and, you know,
hmm
people like, oh, that's a good one, you know,
yeah,
because just when you're
yeah,
pouring your heart into something and a very broken heart, um is my coping mechanism, is my healthy one. The whole
yeah,
coming home and doing shots of alcohol, thinking, you know, I mean, a lot of that when I would go home and do shots, it would be, what the hell was I doing on this street in a soft top Jeep,
yeah,
standing there trying to talk to people at 2 in the morning when there's all these AK-47s being shot? What, you know, like,
yeah,
why do I think that this notebook's going to protect me? Like, I would get home and be like, oh my God, the things that we do for this job. But so that's a different type of trauma. That's the,
sure.
I'm such a fool.
That's on
And now,
yourself more than anything,
yeah, it's
right?
like, but it's your, you know, it's your job when an editor tells you to go and you don't want to say, I'm scared. That's part of the whole female thing.
hmm
Um,
How do you
you know,
find
we
print and broadcast different in these ways, or in kind of the actual
well,
reporting and
in print, I mean, in print, you know, I would do the big, generally, as I got older, I would do the big takeouts, the investigations, the narratives, kind of recreating the scene where
Mhm.
someone died, you know. Um, and in my job now as a broadcast, I'm largely taking kind of a break from it,
Mhm.
because I've, I've done sad stories,
Yeah.
um, but not to the extent that I did as a print reporter in the past years.
Sure.
Um, you know, where I'm working is I started right before the Hurricane Ian, and
Mhm.
so I've been really focused on that, and um, you know, I have a lot of experience covering hurricanes all over, you know, whenever
Sure.
they happen, and um, you know, and sure enough, every place that I went, usually after like the third or fourth day, I was like, I could not stop crying while I'm interviewing people, even if it wasn't their story. You just, when you've got so much like, holy shit, oh my God, and you're hearing so many sad stories, that just sometimes you have to release it, and you're like, oh, sorry, it's coming out kind of stuff, So just, I think just being true to yourself and to your feelings, like I said, like I had told that Vietnam vet who was concerned about my well-being because I was crying so much at the funerals. I was like, no, if the day I stop crying is the day that I need some serious help, because something is completely broken inside me. So
I think that's good though, because I think a lot of times people get so desensitized to things. So the fact that you've been able to still stay so sensitive to it and stay empathetic, I think shows like that you are human.
I don't want to be a journalist I don't want to be a journalist if I become that cynical, desensitized person, which a lot of police officers are, and I do get it, because they they really see some awful shit, and then they have to go home, especially if it's dealing with an old person or a child. They've got mothers, they've got babies, and they've got people yelling at them and not wanting to cooperate, and so I kind of get that why they get jaded. It's and I think if I ever became desensitized, I don't even know what the point of being for me in this business is, because I think my I want to write with heart. I want to tell compelling stories and make people feel, give voice. And if I lose that, then maybe just find a better job.
Right. Well, that's all I have. So thank you so much for joining again.
You're welcome.
Let me go ahead and
pretty much wrap up this episode. I really hope that this was informative and helpful and eye-opening to hear it from the mouths of journalists. Something that's really stuck with me from this episode is when I was talking to Brittany and she was discussing, like, when I asked about the like the general public, and her kind of saying, like, I don't think they really care. And I don't disagree with her, but it just kind of upsets me and makes me sad. So I hope that that kind of narrative and hatred of journalists and of media doesn't affect people too much to lose their humanity or desensitize them to what real people are going to, both the reporters themselves and those that they are reporting on. I mean, it's just so important to think of it that way, and to make sure we're treating each other with love and respect, which sounds so cheesy, I know, but it's so true, because it's just, again, this is really not something I ever thought about until I started my master's program and really dove deeper into it. So I hope that this has been a little bit eye-opening, and I will be back with episode 2 soon. So thank you again for listening.